There we are. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I was just joking with my guest. I was going to use my Arnold Schwarzenegger voice, but I guess I won't do that, you know. Well, that was an interesting conversation we just had with John Matsusaka about the attack on U.S. colleges. So now we get to talk about the Vatican and the Pope. With me today is Theo. I never can say is Zenou. How do you say it? How do you say your last name?
It's anyone's guess, including mine, but technically it's actually Zenou.
Zenou. It's a cool name. Theo Zenou. That's a good French name because you are French, right? That's right.
Yes,
You're French. Okay. You're one of the few Frenchmen I like, so I just have to make that very clear up front. So,
my pleasure.
well, welcome to the show, Theo. It's always good to have you on here. So today we're talking about the Pope and what's going on. We have a new Pope, and I will tell you that if I were a betting man, which sadly I am, I never would have chosen and thought that this was going to be the Pope in America. So first of all, tell us what's going on with the new Pope, and in your opinion, is it a good selection or a not so good selection?
Well, I am not a betting man, but if I were, I also would not have been betting on Robert Francis Prevost to become Pope. So the previous Pope, Pope Francis, was Pope for nearly 12 years, and he died. And when a Pope dies, there is a conclave where all of the cardinals of the Catholic Church come together and select a new pontiff. And the thing about the conclave is that it's a secret election. So there is a lot of speculation in the media about who is going to be a favorite and who might win. But the truth is, only the cardinals really know who are the favorites. And as it turned out, this relatively unknown American cardinal would only worked at the Vatican, being in charge of the bishop for 2 years, won. And he won for a simple reason, which is that the church, much like politics, which you cover extensively on your show, is very polarized. And you have hardcore traditionalists, which would be like hardcore conservatives in politics. And then you've got more progressive types who want to reform the religion. Pope Francis, although he was not a hardcore progressive, certainly lent toward the progressive. And in so doing, further polarized and divided the church. And Robert Francis Prevost would fall somewhere in the middle. And his choice is a choice of consensus. He was picked as Pope very early on. After only 4 ballots, we show that he was a favorite going in and that all of the cardinals realize this is someone everyone can live with. So someone that's not too offensive to any one faction. In that regard, it's probably a good choice to bring stability and a sense of normalcy back to the church after the years of Francis. However, if you're thinking more long term, and if you're also thinking that there are massive changes that need to happen in the church, this new Pope might simply be a Pope of the status quo.
Well, that's an interesting question. So, we are in a very polarized world. I would say even more polarized than we've been in a generation. Um, so here's a question that I don't know if you can answer or want to. Is it how important is a stable Catholic Church in today's society?
So nowhere near as important as it used to be, of course, when the Catholic Church was essentially running the show, certainly in Europe. But nonetheless, the Pope and the Catholic Church still have importance. The Pope is a global leader, is a statesman. I mean, he literally is the head of a state, Vatican City state. And his pronouncement on international relations, on economic development, are closely watched. So he has a great bully pulpit, to use a term from your countryman, Teddy Roosevelt. The Catholic Church in and of itself still has huge influence across the world, just not really in Europe. In America, we've seen the rise of very conservative Catholic statesmen, and we have J.D. Vance, we have a lot of the Supreme Court that are also Catholics, we have a lot of the big backers of MAGA who are Catholics, and they're certainly proud Catholics, and they feel like the teachings of the Catholic Church, or what they see as the teaching of the Catholic Church, shall influence American society at large. And in South America, Africa, and indeed Asia, the church is still very influential. Its pronouncement on things like contraception or social matters are closely watched. So despite it all, despite the waning influence of the church in Europe, it still carries a significant amount of influence in the global South and even in the United States.
Well, and do you think that there's always a conspiracy theorist out there, My brother even said something like, well, it was, Trump was behind choosing the new pope, which I don't think Trump has that much power. But do you think that the choice of this American as pope had anything to do with Trump?
I think we have a tendency to want everything to have something to do with Trump today. And, the Roman Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, roughly, give or take. And as the phrase goes, I think in centuries, not in years or decades. So I would refrain from the urge to see this through the prism of Trump. And I really doubt that when the cardinals of an institution that is so venerable are picking a successor to St. Peter, they are thinking about who will please or displease Donald Trump. Donald Trump will be here for 4 years, supposedly wants to be for more. This pope will probably be here for 20 years or 25 years. So by the end of his papacy, his legacy will have nothing to do with Trump.
You saw just before conclave, I think, or as conclave was beginning, Pope put on his social media a picture of him dressed as a pope. There's a lot of outcry and pushback against that. And then, of course, the new pope is an American. So, there will be those conspiracies. And my bet is that at some point in time, I'm sure Trump will come out and say, I'm responsible for the new pope, but we'll see what happens. But
undoubtedly. However, on this point, what appears to be the new pope's ex-Twitter account showed some criticism of the Trump administration and of J.D. Vance, and showed some criticism of the deportation policies. So just because the Pope is American doesn't mean it will necessarily align with the Trump administration. If anything, it will actually be more likely to continue Pope Francis's legacy of opposing the Trump administration, both on its immigration policies and as well on its economic development policies, so cutting U.S. aid and so on.
Well, this is interesting about aid, because I was going to ask you, with America kind of stepping back from their role in providing international aid, do you see that the Catholic Church is now going to step up and help fill the void where aid is being pulled back by the U.S.?
I think the church would like to, but it has terrible finances. I mean, perpetually it has terrible finances in the modern age. So today they have a huge black hole in Vatican finances, so they really can't afford to, and they rely on donations in order to do so. And so, for instance, one of the biggest Catholic food aid programs in the world was financed by US aid and by the US. So what Trump does directly affects them in a negative way. That's why the bishops, both in America and around the world, were so opposed to the gutting of the aid budgets. And there is another aspect here that's even more perverse, which is that the big donors to the Catholic Church, a lot of them are conservative Republicans, big MAGA types. So to an extent, they also rely on them for funding. And since they are in a bind financially, they might need to turn to them in order to help fix up Vatican finances.
Let's talk about the impact of the church around the world, especially in Africa. I mean, because there was on the short list, I guess it's a bishop from, I guess it's a bishop or a cardinal from Ghana.
Yes.
And is the Catholic Church growing in West Africa?
The Catholic Church is definitely growing in West Africa, and indeed in all of Africa. It's one of the places in the world where it's growing the most. And it's not simply growing in terms of Catholics who go to Mass, it's also growing in terms of people who join the priesthood. And so where I live in Western Europe, you have a shortage of priests. And so priests from Africa are sent to the global north, to villages in France or Spain or England, whereas it used to be 200 years ago the opposite. You had missionaries from the global north who went south in order to spread the good news.
That's interesting. So I didn't even think about the fact that there's a potential lack of priests. But okay, I got to wrap my head around this now. So what you're seeing is that those entering the priesthood are people in Africa, and that they are actually being dispersed around the world in the different dioceses to preach, correct? And let me ask you this: do you see that in countries or in areas where there's poor economics, that you see a greater number of people trying to go into the priesthood? Is that one of the deciding factors, you think?
It's officially it's not a deciding factor because it has to do with faith, but I think in
Well,
truth,
yeah.
of course, it is a deciding factor. You have fewer options, and becoming a priest on one hand is you get free food for the rest of your life, you get a small pension, you get a place to live, you get a community, and that can be a lot. On the other hand, of course, priesthood is quite rigorous in that it supposedly demands celibacy. So that's something that refrains a lot of people from joining, maybe not so much in the global south, but certainly in the north.
Well, I'm probably going to be in trouble for this, but I say I can never be a vegan because I can never give up cheese, and I can never be a priest because celibacy is definitely not in my
Amen.
cards. So, yeah. But nothing against all the priests around the world, because in the political world, I would tell you, especially in the United States, what we have in politics, we have what we call instructed votes, where, as politicians, we would spend a lot of time going to whether they're Catholic priests or ministers and talking to them, because on Sundays they have a tremendous impact politically, because they can go out and they may not explicitly say vote for this person, but they do have an impact about who is elected, right? So this Pope, as you talk about, they have the bully pulpit. They can have a huge impact around the world about who these future leaders are, correct?
Entirely. And we've seen this really for at least the past century since the papacy has embraced the modern age. So a pope that you probably will like as a defender of freedom is Pope John Paul II, who did tremendous work in order to oppose the communist bloc. He came from Poland, and he, frankly, is one of the main actors responsible for the fall of the communist regime in Poland. He supported the Polish resistance there, solidarity. And after that, we've seen Pope after Pope take political stances when and if needed. And Pope Francis especially was very, very strong on this. He opposed Trump from the get-go. He opposed what he called a sort of predatory, ravageous form of capitalism. He spoke a lot about climate change and wrote an entire encyclical about that. And so now the question becomes, what kind of statements will Pope Leo XIV want to make? And the name that the Pope picks actually says a lot about who they want to be. And he picked Pope Leo XIV as a reference in part to Pope Leo XIII, who was Pope at the end of the 19th century. And he are really two things that characterize him. The first is that he's a very traditional Pope in terms of doctrine, and he embraced Mary, and he made the Rosary very popular again in prayer. And so that's probably a message from Pope Leo XIV to the conservative wing of the church, that he was not going to shake things up too much. However, Pope Leo XIII, his predecessor, was also the founder of modern Catholic social teaching, which said that the church actually had a role to play in society and had to create a third way between socialism, which was very, very popular at the time, and unbridled capitalism. That workers needed to be protected, that fair wages needed to be ensured, that the industrial revolution that was going on at the time needed to be honest for the good of humanity. And most likely Leo XIV would want to do the same thing in a new context where the current revolution is not an industrial revolution, it's an AI revolution. What does that mean for the fate of humanity? Does that mean people are going to be made redundant? How do you ensure everybody can have a fair living wage when computers do most of the work for us? These are going to be big questions into the 21st century, and Pope Leo XIV will probably use his bully pulpit to address them.
I think didn't Pope Leo already come out and say some things about AI?
Absolutely. In fact, he explained that we're in a fourth industrial revolution, and that the church needed to speak out in order to find fair, equitable ways to ensure that the AI transition, which cannot be stopped, is done for the betterment of humanity and not for its enslavement.
Listen, I believe in God. I believe that we will all be judged when we get to the pearly gates. There's no doubt about it. And I think in a world where, if you look what's happening in Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, South America, the world is in conflict. And I think more than ever that we need to have faith. We need to, start believing and praying for the resolution of some of these things. And I think that one of the things that we lack, in our governmental leaders is faith, in my opinion. So that's something that we have to work on. So let me ask you this: what do you think the number one thing that we're going to see come out of this papacy?
At first, absolutely nothing. So remember, the popes work on a different timeline than politicians. They don't have the first 100 days where they're signing executive orders and trying to shake things up in the way you've seen Trump do it, or even some of his predecessors to an extent. At first, he's just going to try and keep everything simmering, make everything happy, but his men in positions of power within the Vatican. And that might take months, if not up to a year. He also seems to be a very cautious person. However, as time goes on, I think you will start to see two things that will probably mark his legacy. The first is uniting the church again between liberal and conservative, and that will mean stopping some of the reform Pope Francis has done and essentially holding true to core Catholic doctrines without shaking things up too much. The other one will be probably a big push to be seen as a pope that takes on AI, maybe takes on big tech, and who also speaks out for peace in the world as his predecessors have done. So trying to find ceasefires in Ukraine, trying to find ceasefires in Gaza. And it wasn't an accident that Trump and Zelensky's second meeting was in the Vatican on the side of Pope Francis' funeral. I think the Vatican will want to play a key role in settling the Russia-Ukrainian war. Pope Leo's first meeting with a world leader was with Zelensky. His first phone call with a world leader was with Zelensky. I think he supports Ukraine, and he wants to make sure that if and when the war ends, Ukraine emerges protected, safe, and is able to rebuild in a free and democratic way.
Well, listen, I think you're right in so many ways, as usual, Theo. And I think that one thing the world needs more than anything right now is stability. And of the 1.6 or 7 billion Catholics in the world, we need to find maybe that they do have I do believe that they have a place, regardless of your religious beliefs. They have a place in bringing greater stability. Well, Theo, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. You're an excellent guest. You know so much about so many things. I look forward to having you on the show again. So we'll talk soon. Thanks for being with Dane Waters, Around the World with Dane Waters, and I will see you next week. Thank you very much.
Be well.